Here's something they don't teach you in history class. Winston Churchill didn't just beat Hitler with speeches and soldiers. He beat him with something far more devastating: economics. And the irony? Hitler never saw it coming. Picture this: May 10, 1940. The same day Hitler invades France, a 65-year-old man with a cigar and a drinking problem becomes Prime Minister of Britain. Most people thought Churchill was washed up, a has-been politician who'd failed spectacularly at everything from Gallipoli to the gold standard. But here's what they missed: Churchill understood money, real money, the kind that wins wars. Let me tell you about Churchill's secret weapon, and it wasn't the RAF. It was something called financial warfare, and it was absolutely brutal. See, while everyone focuses on Churchill's famous speeches, "We shall fight on the beaches," and all that poetry, they ignore what he was doing behind closed doors. Within weeks of taking power, Churchill created something called the Special Operations Executive, or SOE. Yeah, they did sabotage and espionage, but here's the part that'll blow your mind. They had an entire division dedicated to economic warfare. Their job? Destroy the Nazi economy from within. Churchill knew something fundamental that Hitler didn't. Modern war isn't won by tanks and planes alone. It's won by whoever can keep paying for tanks and planes the longest. And Britain was broke, completely, utterly broke. By June 1940, Britain's gold reserves were hemorrhaging. They were spending money they didn't have on a war they couldn't afford. The treasury was in full panic mode. Some historians estimate Britain was weeks away from financial collapse. Chancellor Kingsley Wood told Churchill straight up, "We cannot continue this war beyond December without American aid." So what did Churchill do? He went all in on the biggest financial gamble in history. And Hitler? He was about to find out what happens when you fight a war of attrition against a man who used to be First Lord of the Admiralty and who understood naval blockades, trade routes, and economic strangulation better than any general understood battle tactics. But here's where it gets really interesting. Hitler's entire economic model was based on conquest. He called it Weltwirtschaft, defense economy. Basically, steal everything from the countries you invade to fund the next invasion. It worked brilliantly, until it didn't, because Churchill understood that Hitler's economy was a Ponzi scheme, and like all Ponzi schemes, it required constant expansion. Stop expanding, and the whole thing collapses. Churchill's strategy was simple and devastating. Make Hitler's war as expensive as possible for as long as possible until the Nazi economy imploded under its own weight. This wasn't just military strategy. This was economic warfare at its most sophisticated. And the man orchestrating this financial destruction? He'd spent the 1930s literally speculating on currency markets and writing newspaper columns to pay his bills. Churchill was broke himself for most of his life, terrible with personal finances, constantly in debt. But national finances? That was different. That was war. And Churchill was about to wage the most expensive war in human history, with money he didn't have.
Let's talk about the greatest heist in history. And no, I'm not talking about Hitler stealing Europe's gold. I'm talking about what Churchill did to America. March 11th, 1941. President Franklin D. Roosevelt signs the Lend-Lease Act. Churchill called it the most unsordid act in the history of any nation. Beautiful quote. Absolute nonsense. This wasn't charity. This was Churchill pulling off the most brilliant financial manipulation of the 20th century. Here's what actually happened. By early 1941, Britain was financially dead. I'm not exaggerating. They'd liquidated almost every asset they had. They sold securities, gold, everything. They even sold a British-owned island in the Caribbean to the US for destroyers. Britain was literally selling real estate to pay for the war. American law said you couldn't just give weapons away. It was called the Neutrality Acts. Churchill knew this, so he did something absolutely genius. He manipulated American public opinion so brilliantly that FDR had no choice but to find a loophole. Roosevelt's solution? Lend-Lease. The name itself is propaganda. You're not lending bombers, you're giving them away. Everyone knew the stuff wasn't coming back, but calling it Lend-Lease made it sound temporary, responsible, businesslike. It was marketing genius. The numbers are staggering. By the end of the war, America had sent Britain over $31 billion in aid. That's over $480 billion in today's money. Britain sent back about $6 billion worth of reverse Lend-Lease. They still owed $4.33 billion when the war ended and didn't finish paying it off until December 31, 2006, 61 years later. But here's the really twisted part. While Churchill was getting free weapons from America, he was simultaneously funding Stalin. Yeah, the same Stalin who signed a non-aggression pact with Hitler in 1939, the same Stalin who helped Hitler invade Poland. The moment Hitler betrayed Stalin in June 1941 with Operation Barbarossa, Churchill immediately pledged support. His quote is famous: "If Hitler invaded hell, I would at least make a favorable reference to the devil in the House of Commons." Sounds principled, right? It wasn't. It was cold calculation. Churchill knew Hitler was broke, so what did he do? He made the war more expensive. Strategic bombing wasn't just about destroying factories, though that was part of it. It was about forcing Germany to divert resources into air defense. Every flak gun was steel that couldn't become a tank. Every fighter plane defending Berlin was one less plane attacking Britain. Meanwhile, Churchill's treasury was running economic warfare operations that history barely remembers. They counterfeited German currency, they manipulated exchange rates in neutral countries, they bought up strategic resources in Spain and Turkey just to keep them out of German hands, even if Britain didn't need them. They froze German assets globally, they blacklisted companies that traded with the Nazis. It was financial terrorism on a global scale. And it worked. By the end of 1943, the German economy was in a death spiral. They'd looted everything they could from occupied Europe, enslaved millions for forced labor, and still couldn't keep up with the war's costs. Meanwhile, American factories were pumping out weapons that Churchill was distributing for free to anyone fighting Hitler. The Lend-Lease program was Churchill's masterstroke because it did something unprecedented. It turned American industrial capacity into Britain's arsenal without requiring Britain to pay for it until decades later. Hitler was fighting the richest country in the world. He just didn't realize it yet because Churchill had disguised it as aid. Want to know the real reason Germany lost World War II? Forget D-Day. Forget Stalingrad. The answer is simpler. They ran out of oil. Churchill knew this from day one, and he'd learned it the hard way because in World War I, he'd been the guy in charge of the Royal Navy when they switched from coal to oil. He understood energy security better than any leader alive. Germany in 1940 was producing about 4 million tons of oil per year. They needed about 10 million. That 6 million ton gap? That was Hitler's death sentence. Churchill just had to make sure it stayed a gap. Here's how it worked. The British Royal Navy, which Churchill had once commanded as First Lord of the Admiralty, implemented what they called the British blockade. But this wasn't like the blockades of old. This was a global economic stranglehold using financial tools as much as warships. Britain controlled the world's maritime insurance through Lloyd's of London. If you wanted to ship anything anywhere by sea, you needed insurance. And suddenly, any ship carrying goods to Germany or German-occupied territory couldn't get insured. No insurance, no shipping. No shipping, no trade. The neutral countries, Spain, Turkey, Sweden, quickly learned that trading with Germany meant being cut off from the entire British financial system. Churchill weaponized sterling. The British pound was still a global reserve currency in 1940. Britain threatened to freeze assets and deny access to London's financial markets for any bank that helped the Nazis. It was economic blackmail on an unprecedented scale. And it worked. But here's where it gets really dark. The blockade didn't just target military supplies. It targeted food, medicine, civilian goods. Churchill was quite literally starving Europe to weaken Hitler, and he knew exactly what he was doing. In occupied territories, millions suffered food shortages. The Dutch hunger winter of 1944-45 killed over 20,000 civilians. Greece experienced famine. This wasn't accidental collateral damage. This was policy. Churchill had calculated that civilian suffering in occupied countries would either turn populations against the Nazis or force Germany to divert resources to feed them, resources they didn't have. Was it moral? Hell no. Was it effective? Absolutely.
here's the crucial detail everyone forgets. Hitler's entire war machine ran on synthetic fuel made from coal. The Nazis had built massive hydrogenation plants that converted coal into gasoline. By 1944, these plants were producing almost all of Germany's aviation fuel. Churchill knew this, so what did he do? He bombed them relentlessly. The combined bomber offensive specifically targeted German synthetic fuel plants starting in May 1944. Within months, German fuel production dropped by 90%. By December 1944, the Luftwaffe was grounded. Not because they didn't have planes, they had plenty. They didn't have fuel. The Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's last major offensive in December 1944, failed primarily because German tanks ran out of gas. Literally. They captured Allied fuel depots specifically because they couldn't get fuel from Germany. When that failed, thousands of tanks were abandoned on the roadside, empty. And the cost? Churchill's bomber offensive was staggeringly expensive, but again, America was paying for it through Lend-Lease. The RAF lost 55,573 aircrew killed in bomber operations. That's more than the entire U.S. Marine Corps lost in World War II. But economically, Churchill could afford it because Roosevelt was footing the bill. Meanwhile, Hitler was spending money he didn't have, trying to defend against attacks funded by money Churchill didn't have. It was a race to see whose economy would collapse first. Except Churchill had American credit and Hitler had stolen French gold and IOUs from countries he'd conquered. By 1944, the German economy was in total collapse. Inflation was spiraling despite brutal price controls. Workers were being paid in worthless Reichsmarks. The black market was the only functional economy left. And Hitler? He was still printing money and issuing bonds that everyone knew would never be repaid. Churchill had done it. He'd turned World War II into a war of economic attrition. And Britain's economy, backed by American industry and Soviet manpower, had more endurance than Germany's kleptocratic war machine. The blockade wasn't just ships stopping ships. It was a complete economic isolation campaign using every tool of modern finance. And it strangled the Nazi war machine more effectively than any army ever could. Let's talk about the moment Hitler's economic house of cards finally collapsed. And spoiler alert, it happened before Berlin fell. By January 1945, the German economy was functionally dead. Not dying, dead. And Churchill had spent 5 years methodically killing it. Here are numbers they don't teach in school. By war's end, the Reichsmark was worth approximately 1/10 of 1 cent. Hyperinflation was being suppressed only through totalitarian price controls and the threat of execution for black market trading. The German government was printing money so fast that they literally ran out of paper and started printing on one side only. German war bonds, the Kriegsanleihe that Hitler had issued to fund the war, were worthless. Everyone knew it. The government itself knew it, but they kept issuing them anyway because it was either that or admit the regime was bankrupt. By 1945, German citizens had been forced to voluntarily purchase over 400 billion Reichsmarks in war bonds. That's roughly $1.6 trillion in modern money. None of it would ever be repaid. Churchill's financial warfare had created a feedback loop of economic destruction. The more resources Hitler diverted to the war, the less the German economy could function. The less it functioned, the more he had to loot from occupied territories. The more he looted, the more resistance movements formed. The more resistance formed, the more resources he needed, round and round until the whole system ate itself. But here's the really insane part. Hitler never understood economics, not even a little. He believed in willpower and racial superiority determining economic outcomes. He genuinely thought Germany could spend infinite money on the war because the Jewish financial system would collapse before the Aryan will did. This is not exaggeration. Read his speeches. The man thought economics was a Jewish conspiracy to weaken strong nations. Churchill, meanwhile, was the opposite. He'd spent his entire political career dealing with budgets, trade, currency policy, and financial crises. He'd been Chancellor of the Exchequer. He understood money as power. and he used that understanding to methodically dismantle Hitler's economy. Albert Speer, Hitler's Minister of Armaments, wrote after the war that Germany's economic collapse was inevitable by mid-1944. The strategic bombing of fuel plants, the loss of Romanian oil fields in August 1944, and the complete breakdown of transportation infrastructure meant that even if Germany had unlimited raw materials, they couldn't move them. Factories stood idle. Workers starved. The economy had become a corpse being puppeteered by Nazi propaganda. And the grand alliance that Churchill had built? It was an economic alliance as much as a military one. Britain provided intelligence and strategic planning. America provided industry and money. The Soviet Union provided manpower and resources. Together, they represented over 60% of global GDP. Germany and its allies? Maybe 15%. Churchill had turned World War II into an economic math problem, and in math, 60 beats 15 every single time. Here's a detail that'll make you laugh. In April 1945, as Berlin was being encircled, the Nazi government was still trying to negotiate loans from neutral countries. They genuinely believed someone would lend them money. Switzerland politely declined. Sweden said no. Even Franco's Spain, which owed Germany money for supporting them in the Spanish Civil War, refused. The Thousand-Year Reich died broke, in debt, and economically irrelevant. Churchill had turned Hitler's empire into a failed state before the shooting even stopped. And Churchill himself? Britain ended the war with debts of £3.4 billion, over £140 billion today. They were financially ruined, but they'd won. Because sometimes winning means convincing someone else to pay for your victory, and nobody in history has ever done that better than Winston Churchill. The final insult? At the Potsdam Conference in July 1945, the Allies discussed German reparations. The Soviets wanted to strip Germany of industrial capacity. Churchill, who'd just lost the election but was still attending, suggested a different approach. Don't demand money Germany doesn't have. Just make sure they never build another war economy. He'd learned the lesson of Versailles. You can't squeeze blood from a stone, but you can make sure the stone never becomes a weapon again. It was economic wisdom born from watching Hitler's Ponzi scheme collapse in real time. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Churchill bankrupted Britain to beat Hitler, and then Britain spent the next 60 years paying America back for the privilege. The final Lend-Lease payment was made on December 31st, 2006. Britain had been making annual payments of $83.25 million. That's not historical trivia. That's a financial relationship that lasted from World War II into the age of smartphones and social media. Think about that. Your grandparents' war debt was being paid off when Facebook launched. But here's what makes Churchill's economic warfare so fascinating. It worked so well that it changed how wars are fought forever. After World War II, every major conflict has had an economic component. The Cold War? Economic competition between capitalism and communism. The Gulf War? Oil and petrodollars. The War on Terror? Freezing assets and financial surveillance. Churchill pioneered financial warfare as a strategic weapon, and the whole world copied his playbook. Let's talk about the real cost. Britain entered World War II as a global empire and emerged as a bankrupt junior partner to the United States. The empire dissolved. India gained independence in 1947. The pound lost its status as a reserve currency. Britain had to implement austerity measures that lasted into the 1950s. Rationing in Britain didn't end until 1954, 9 years after the war ended. Was it worth it? Churchill thought so. But here's the thing nobody wants to admit. Britain never really recovered. The British Empire was sacrificed to stop Hitler. Churchill made that trade knowingly. He understood that defeating Nazi Germany would cost Britain its global supremacy, and he did it anyway. That's the part of the story that makes Churchill genuinely heroic. Not the speeches, not the cigars, but the fact that he knowingly bankrupted his own country and dissolved its empire because the alternative was worse. Hitler's economic legacy is even more stark. Germany was literally divided in half. Its currency was worthless. Its industry was dismantled. For decades, "Made in Germany" was stamped on goods as a warning, not a mark of quality. The economic destruction was so complete that Germany had to start from scratch. But here's the twisted irony. The economic devastation is exactly why the Marshall Plan worked so well in Germany. There was nothing left to rebuild around, just start fresh. By the 1960s, West Germany had the strongest economy in Europe. The Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle. They'd learned that you can't fund a government through conquest and theft. You have to actually create value. Churchill's financial warfare taught the world a lesson that Hitler never learned. Modern economies are too interconnected to sustain themselves through pure looting. You need trade, you need credit, you need international cooperation. The moment you try to exist outside that system through pure military force, the system will strangle you. And here's the part that should terrify you. Everything Churchill did, weaponizing currency, financial sanctions, economic blockades, manipulating trade, freezing assets, all of it is standard international policy now. When Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, the West immediately cut Russia off from SWIFT, froze assets, and implemented sanctions. That's Churchill's playbook. When Iran pursued nuclear weapons, the response was economic isolation, Churchill's playbook again. Financial warfare is now the first resort, not the last, and it all traces back to Churchill's desperate, brilliant, morally questionable campaign to bankrupt Hitler. Churchill died in 1965, 20 years after the war ended. Britain was still paying off Lend-Lease, the empire was gone, the pound was weak, but Nazi Germany was a historical footnote, and the Holocaust had been stopped. In Churchill's calculus, that was the trade. Imperial power for human decency, economic dominance for moral victory. History remembers Churchill for his speeches, "We shall fight on the beaches," "Their finest hour," "Never surrender." Beautiful words. But Churchill's real legacy isn't rhetoric. It's the financial architecture of modern warfare. It's the understanding that in industrial societies, wars are won by economics as much as by armies. Hitler built an empire on stolen wealth and military conquest. Churchill built an alliance on American credit and British intelligence. One was a Ponzi scheme, the other was a balance sheet. And in the end, the accountants beat the ideologues. That's the story they don't tell you. Hitler's worst nightmare wasn't D-Day or Stalingrad or the RAF. It was a 65-year-old man with a cigar, a drinking problem, and an intimate understanding of how to weaponize a financial system. Churchill didn't just defeat Hitler militarily, he bankrupted him. He turned World War II into an economic war of attrition and made damn sure Britain, broke, desperate, and alone, could outlast Nazi Germany. And the truly insane part, it worked. Against all odds, despite Britain being functionally bankrupt by 1940, despite standing alone against the most powerful military in Europe, despite every rational calculation saying they should surrender, Churchill's economic warfare ground Hitler's war machine into dust. So here's the final question. Was Churchill a hero or a con artist? Did he save the world or just convince America to pay for saving it? Maybe he was both. Maybe that's what it took. Maybe the greatest act of statesmanship in the 20th century was one man convincing another man to write a blank check, then using that check to bankrupt a dictator. History is written by the victors. Economics is written by whoever has more money. Churchill understood both. Hitler understood neither. And that made all the difference.